Thank you for the song this morning. We will be going to Isaiah chapter 9. As we continue our series in the book of Isaiah, this is now message number 13, entitled Darkness to Light. And we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 7. And this is a key messianic prophecy. So we're actually going to be looking at this passage in this service and in the next. So in this one, we'll cover the first 5 verses, and then we'll look at verses 6 and 7 in the next service. So we're going to start here, but I am going to read all 7 of these verses to get the entirety of this passage. Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shine. Thou hast multiplied the nation, and not increased the joy. They joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For thou hast broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So chapters 7 and 8 marked a new unit in Isaiah's prophecy. It's oftentimes referred to as the book of Emmanuel, chapters 7 to 12. And this is because in these few chapters, there's just a density of messianic prophecies like the one we're looking at here this morning that begins with the virgin birth prophecy in chapter 7, and that was fulfilled in miraculous fashion with Mary and Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. There was also a notable shift when you read verses 1 to 6, and then you come to verse 7, chapters 1 to 6, and then chapter 7 and 8. You can see a shift in the way and the structure and things that's going on in these chapters. Isaiah has been sent to King Ahaz, which is sometime later than the previous chapters. And the word of the Lord in chapter 7 and 8 involves some present concerns as well as far-off future prophecies. So Judah as a nation had been economically prosperous, had been militarily strong, but still was comparatively small and certainly not able to withstand a coalition of nations that would come against them. Ahaz had refused league with Israel and Syria and was secretly trying to form an alliance with Assyria, which would in the end be bad for Judah. But Isaiah was sent to warn Ahaz. Don't join with Assyria. Don't put your trust in them. Trust in the Lord. He's going to deliver. All the schemes and the stratagem of Israel and Syria are not going to come to pass. And we saw this was brought out in a few different ways in chapter 7 and 8. So it was brought out in the giving of revelation, like the uncovering of the secret plot of Rezin and Pekah to depose Ahaz. It was given in terms of prophecies, the speaking of future events, how these things would come out. Also in symbolic names, in Isaiah's son and his son that was to be born, and then the son born to the virgin there in chapter 7. Now, chapter 8 ended with prophecies of judgment that meant devastation and exile for Israel and Judah. And so they would be left in darkness and despair. Well, chapter 9 continues this word to Ahaz, and it actually runs at least through chapter 10 and verse number 4, and then we start the pronouncement of some judgment woes. But this word to Ahaz is continued. The darkness, the despair, and the desolation, we find out, are not the final word. It could seem that way if you just read it to the end of chapter 8 and then stop, but that's not the final word for Israel and for Judah. So verses 1 to 7 here in chapter 9 give us a prophecy of redemption and restoration that is then followed by more judgment in the rest of the chapter. So we've already seen a pattern in Isaiah's prophecy where there's a mingling of judgment prophecies and restoration prophecies. And in chapters 1 to 6, it formed a very well-defined cycle that gave really structure to that passage. And so this unit that we're looking at now, beginning with chapter 7, is structured differently from that, but that's still a pattern we're going to be able to see, this mingling of judgment and restoration. So this prophecy, and as is very consistent in this section, revolves around the birth of a son. So chapter 7 to 12, there's the importance of a birth of a son in these chapters. We've already seen it in chapter 7 and 8. We see it here. We'll see it here again in chapter 11. But verses 1 to 7 is a key messianic prophecy, and it blends the first and the second coming of Christ without any indication of a gap between them. And so we've talked about this a number of times. We've seen some examples. This is a very good example because it has a blending of these things as if it's just sort of one event, but it's not. And it'd be easy to read it as one event, but it's really different events that have a long gap of time between them. And so Peter referred to this aspect of Old Testament prophecy. He talked about the prophets, how that they wrote and they inquired about this person, this Messiah, who this person would be. And not only that, but as Peter said, of the sufferings and the glory of the Messiah. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10 to 11. And that really was quite a conundrum. How can we have prophecies of the glory of the Messiah, the glory of this king, and then also have prophecies of suffering and rejection and even death? And how do those things go together? And in some of the Jewish traditions, they had actually developed a sort of a two Messiah theory, that there was one that would be that would suffer and be rejected and die, and then there was another that would come and would be victorious. So a number of ways have been invented to try to deal with that. But we understand, of course, with the coming of Christ, what these things mean. So this prophecy here in the beginning of chapter 9 also has certain specificity to it and uses intertextual reference and also uses another element. It has elements that give us opportunity to learn about interpreting prophecies as we see this repeated in other places. So we're going to look at this, the first 5 verses, and we're going to look at it in 2 parts, verses 1 and 2, where we get the reference to the former and the latter time, and verses 3 to 5, where we get the burning of the clothes of war. So we'll start here with the first one. Let's read verse 1 again. Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. So this verse opens up with a contrast. And chapter 8 ends with the darkness and the despair. And this verse opens up with the contrast and referring to that darkness, that desolation and despair from the previous. It's not going to be permanent. It's not going to be final. The indications have been that it's going to last a long time, referring to these exile judgments. It's going to begin in a short time from when Isaiah spoke these words to Ahaz, but it's going to be a long time that these are going to go on, but not forever. There will be an end to them. There will be a reversal. There will be a redemption and a restoration, but that is to come in the latter time. Now, notice here in verse 1 when he says at the first, and then we get a reference down to and afterward. At the first and afterward. And these are time markers, and they don't stick out as much when you read it here in the authorized version. Some newer translations have put these as former time and latter time, which brings out the distinction here a little bit more. The former time is actually the time that began with the Assyrian invasions and the conquering of the northern kingdom. That was still a few years off when Isaiah spoke these words. It hadn't happened yet, but it was going to happen soon. And so this is an example of what I refer to as the prophetic perfect term that some different scholars and commentators use to talk about when a prophet speaks about something in the past tense as if it's already happened, but is actually a prophecy of something to occur in the future. So this happens repeatedly in this passage in verses 1 to 7. Isaiah speaks in the past tense as if all of these things have already happened, but they haven't. They hadn't even, none of them had even happened by the time that he spoke these words. Now they would begin the former time. And notice that distinction. There's events that are going to take place in a former time, and there's events that are going to take place in a latter time, which is, again, indicative of a long span of time, and that these events are going to take place. And Isaiah refers to both of them as if they've already occurred. And they obviously hadn't. So that's what's referred to as the prophetic perfect. So that is something to watch for when we are reading prophecy and we're trying to understand what's being spoken of. Just because the tense that's being used, whether it's not spoken in the future, doesn't mean that it's not a future prophecy. Now, the Assyrian invasion is what's referred to here as is translated here as lightly afflicted. The light affliction that began this darkness was the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom that resulted in their carrying away in 722 BC. By around 60-some years later, they were all pretty well. Most of the Israel had been taken and scattered among the nations, and those of the nations had been brought in and sort of settled in Israel. One of the things leading to this term Galilee of the nations that we see in this passage as well. The latter time that Isaiah refers to coincides with the last of days time frame that Isaiah has already referred to back in chapter 2 and verse number 2. And remember, that's when the redemption of Israel and Zion will occur in the last of days. So you can see the dimness will not be such as it was when at the first and then afterward. And so there is a jump that occurs there. Isaiah speaking as if it's already occurred. Now, the exile judgments will be light afflictions, and they're light afflictions compared to the grievous time of tribulation for Israel in the last. Now, we've already seen Isaiah giving reference to these judgments in the last of days, and this really begins all the way back in the writings of Moses. Moses was the first to prophesy of this. So just a couple of examples. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 30 and 31. When thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the latter days, if thou turn, and so on. And then he goes on to talk about the repentance that will come. But he's talking about the fact that they're going to break this covenant. They're not going to keep it. And all of these curses that God had promised that he would visit on them for breaking his covenant, Moses is telling them that's going to happen. It's going to happen. You're going to be expelled from the land. You're going to be exiled. All this is going to come upon you in the latter days. And when you turn, or if you turn, which is again the condition, they will turn, and he will have mercy on them. Deuteronomy 31:29. Moses said, "For I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves and turn aside from the way I have commanded you." This is reference to the Old Covenant, the Old Covenant law in particular. "And evil will befall you in the latter days." And remember that Jacob also spoke of those latter days in Genesis chapter 49 when he gave that prophecy of the coming of Shiloh. "Because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands." So again, there is a severity of judgment. And of course, it's not as clear in the prophecy of Jacob and in the prophecy of Moses as what it becomes later in the writings of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel, and then on into the New Testament and so on, about this time, this 70th week, this time of Jacob's trouble and all of that. Now, if we look at these descriptions in this verse, so we've got the light affliction that starts, then we have the more grievous affliction that will come at the latter time, and then we've got this description. And this description, which mentions the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali and so on, this is all description really of the land of the northern kingdom of Israel. Not even really even the entirety of the northern kingdom of Israel, but really the northernmost parts of the northern kingdom of Israel. Zebulun and Naphtali were in northern Israel. They were also the first to be invaded by the Assyrians and fall to them. They were the first ones. And we'll come back to looking at this geographic description because it does have some more importance. But we need to pick up verse 2. Verse 2, the people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. So this verse provides a contrast for these previously described areas. And darkness to light is a very common image that Isaiah uses for the coming of the Messiah and the judgment that turns to redemption and restoration for Israel. Later, also in 58 and verse 8, chapter 60, verse 1, and verses 19 to 20. I think references as well. Judgment is oftentimes portrayed as a great darkness, and salvation as great light. And this darkness and light motif it also has application in the realms of revelation, in the realms of knowledge. It contrasts the judgment on them for seeking alternate revelation and knowledge from the realm of the dead, which we read about just back in chapter 8, verses 19 to 22. These verses, though, verses 1 and 2, are referred to in the New Testament as finding at least partial fulfillment in the first coming of Christ. So Matthew chapter 4, verses 13 to 16. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the seacoast in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up. Nazareth was in the land of Zebulun. Capernaum was in the land of Naphtali, that's referred to. The way of the sea in verse 1 refers to the west of the Sea of Galilee. Beyond Jordan refers to the east of the river, which was referred to as the land of Perea in that time. Galilee of the nations, and we do have the word Goyim that is used here. Galilee of the nations was so called because, on the one hand, it was that northernmost border that bordered other nations besides Israel. In later time, of course, it came to be an area dominated by Gentile populations, and also where the Samaritan people emerged, and we talked about that a little bit previously. But what is all of this? What is all this land, and especially when we see it in connection in Matthew chapter 4? All of this area was the primary area of Jesus' ministry when he was on the earth. This is, when you read the Gospels, this area is primarily where all of those things in the Gospels took place. Yes, he did spend time in Jerusalem and a little bit other, but mostly the major part that we have of description of his ministry took place in these lands that are described here. In other words, this is where he taught the most. This is where he worked the most miracles. And it should have been where they were looking for the Messiah to be doing those things precisely. But the leaders and many of Israel were not. And in fact, we get some reflection of that, John 1:46. And Nathanael said unto him, can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? This land that's described here was despised and looked down on. John 7:52, they answered and said unto him, art thou also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. Isaiah would beg to the contrary. There indeed will be a prophet. Great light is coming to the people in these lands. So this judgment that was to come upon them includes the idea in the language, the idea of these lands being despised. And that's exactly what we see when we look in the Gospels. And though Christ's coming and his ministries in these areas fulfilled this prophecy, it hasn't been fulfilled entirely, because there is still yet this aspect that applies to this latter time that he is referring to. And when we look at this entire passage as it continues to describe, it goes on to describe the redemption and the restoration of Israel that has not occurred. And so, again, it's the former and the latter time. So Jesus has fulfilled this, at least in part, but there's more to be done. But there's no indication as you're reading in Isaiah that there's any gap, that there's any division of the time, or that there's different events that are separated by a long time. It's not clear in Isaiah that that's the case, but it is the case. And in verses 3 to 5, we have further description of this restoration time, which is obviously the result of the Messiah and the result of this great light coming. But it doesn't tie in more specifically until you get to verses 6 and 7. So let's look at verse 3. Thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. They joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. So verses 3 to 5, when you just read them, they're overwhelmingly positive. They're obviously describing this restoration of Israel. And that gives us a context that helps us, because there are some linguistic difficulties here in verse number 3. And translators vary quite a bit on verse 3, and essentially on whether it's negative or positive. And you can see the expression there, and not increase the joy, particularly that line. But when you read it, that doesn't really seem to fit with the other lines, and it doesn't seem to fit with the whole context. So that translation, as I understand it, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, and I've read a bunch of different views on this and the language that underlies it, and not increase the joy, it's not the only viable option for a translation. And so it is also possible to be cast in a more positive light, in that God has increased the joy, or will, as it is a future prophecy. So as I read through that, I followed that, spent some time looking at that. Personally, I find the positive expression of joy being increased to be the more compelling of the translations, because of the context of verse 3, and really the context of verse 3 to 5, which again is overwhelmingly positive, speaking of their restoration. And I really couldn't, as I read those that took the other view, I couldn't really see them making good sense of the whole, giving that negative translation. So that's just why I'm taking it as positive. You may read a commentary that takes it negative. Again, looking at it, the KJV translators obviously took it as a negative expression. Some other translators have not. So that's just sort of why I'm taking it the way that I am. Israel here is referred to as a singular goy, and you see it translated nation, goy. Now, this term goy is first used back in Genesis chapter 10 and verse number 5. And it's used to describe a defined and a distinct, bounded people, set of people, having a common territory, language, kinship, and government. This is the expression of a nation, of a goy. Genesis 10:32 speaks of God's dividing of the nations, which includes land, people, tongues, all of those sort of things. And that is described, of course, in chapter number 11 as you continue reading. And so we have the table of the 70 original nations. And then we have the promise to Abraham that comes in chapter 12. And one of the promises to Abraham is that God would make from him a new great goy, a new nation. He later affirmed that promise to Jacob in Genesis 46:3, that he would make a great goy from him as well. And then later at Sinai, he affirmed this promise to Israel in Exodus 19, verse number 6, when he said they would be a goy kadosh, they would be a holy nation. So it's not entirely unusual for that term to be used of Israel, because it it doesn't, the word itself doesn't indicate anything about Israel or not. It refers to a nation. There's a geopolitical entity that has a common kinship and ethnicity and language and culture and is self-governed, and all of those sort of things is the meaning of the term. Well, Israel was going to be made into one, which means that Israel was going to have an identity like the other nations that we read about in that table before Israel was even formed. They're going to be a new and a distinct nation from the other nations because God has specially chosen Abraham and is going to make them a nation. And when he speaks here about God has multiplied, he has increased that nation, the number of that people, it is referring to his increasing of the chosen nation of Israel and refers to the future fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, that he's going to make a great nation out of Abraham. Now, the continual note that you read here, and you see joy, 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 rejoice, that gets repeated in this verse. And even though Isaiah wrote of this as if it's already happening, it also did not happen with Christ's first coming. This joy, this description, this great nation, they were still under the Roman yoke. This did not happen with Christ's first coming. But when you understand this the way that this reads, then you can understand why the disciples asked what they did in Acts chapter 1 and verse number 6. Because now they had come to understand that the Old Testament meant that the Messiah would have to suffer and be rejected and die and would rise again. And all that had happened in Acts chapter number 1 when they're standing there with Jesus. All that had taken place. And so the disciples say, okay, so now all of this joy and all these other things are going to come, right? This kingdom that gets talked about in verses 6 and 7, that's going to come, right? They had come to understand that, but it still hasn't been fulfilled yet. And what did Christ tell them? It's not for you to know the times and the seasons for the fulfillment of all of these things. So obviously there is a gap between that first coming and that second coming when these other things will be fulfilled. This joy is expressed through two metaphoric images. One is the harvest of farmers. The other is the victory of warriors. So the rejoicing at the harvest, obviously the harvest represents long labor and patience and probably a little bit of worry. I mean, especially when you think of agricultural existence totally dependent on that agricultural existence for the food supply. And then, when it comes time for the harvest, you finally have gotten there, but it's still vulnerable. It's still a time that there's some worry. And so when the harvest is finally collected and it's finally brought in, then there is great joy and rejoicing. And that's the picture that's caught here. And then, of course, the victory of the warriors as they have overcome their enemies. They have divided the spoil, so they have recouped their losses and such, and there's great rejoicing and such. So what's being described here through these images is that this time is going to be a time of great joy and gladness. It's going to be a time of great abundance of food. It's also going to be a time of peace. It's going to be a time of shalom when there's not worry and there's not a sense of insecurity or instability because of the threat of enemies. But notice what else he said there. They, referring to that nation, are going to joy before thee, before Yahweh. This speaks of their acknowledgement of God. In other words, this tells us that repentance and that conversion that Moses prophesied so long ago has taken place. That gathering of the people to himself that Jacob prophesied in Genesis 40, that has taken place when this is fulfilled. So this conversion of the nation has occurred. Now, verses 4 to 7 actually give us a list of explanatory reasons of why and how these events will occur. So let's start here with verse 4. For thou hast broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder and the rod of his oppressor as in the day of Midian. So the yoke and the staff and the rod all speak of oppression. In fact, it's reminiscent of descriptions of slavery and affliction in Egypt. But it's also here compared to the defeat of the Midianites. And this is recorded in through Judges chapter 6 and 7. So if you think about some of the comparison, Judges 6 refers to Midian as a vast host. And some very similar language that Assyria has been described as they're going to come in like a flood that covers the land in chapter 8, verses 7 to 8. In chapter 6 of Judges also, there's going to be the giving of a sign. And in chapter 7 in Isaiah, there was going to be the giving of the sign of Emmanuel in verse number 14. And in Judges, we saw that the deliverance was not going to come through the strength of the flesh. Judges chapter 7, where Gideon's army was reduced to the 300 men, it wasn't going to come by the strength of men and the strength of their arms and their weapons. It wasn't going to come that way. They were going to fight, but that wasn't where the victory was going to be. And rather, the victory is going to come, as it is here, it's going to come through a son. We see that in chapter 7. We see that in chapter 8. We see it here in chapter 9. We're going to see it again in chapter number 11. The victory that is described here in verse 5, for every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. The victory is complete here, and the victory is complete with the destruction of the weapons of war. And that's what we do have described here. And it's described in such a way that even the war clothing of the soldiers is being described here as being rolled up and burned up, being fuel for the fire. So Isaiah has already referred to this occurring in the last of days, when Zion will be exalted in the earth over the nations and warfare will be ended. We read about that back in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. So again, same events, same time frame that is being spoken of. And all these weapons of warfare will be as fuel for the fire. Signs of the peace, signs of the shalom that will come with the coming of Messiah. Now, we're going to stop here. We'll look at verses 6 and 7 in the next message. But when we understand such prophecies and we understand these events, and this passage is also another good example of why that prophecies can be difficult. They can be difficult to read and to interpret and sometimes to separate. Because again, you read this and there's no indication in the passage itself that we're talking about different events that take place at different times that are separated by a long span of time in some cases. So understanding these prophecies, and we, of course, have the advantage. Christ has come. We've been given the completion of the revelation through him and his apostles. And we've also are able to look back on the events of this prophecy that's already unfolded. So that does give us some advantage, I suppose. But when we see that, what it should do is that it should teach us to hope and not despair. And it is easy to despair, to look around in the world around us, in the society around us, and you look at things and if you're anything like me, sometimes you start to think, am I the one that's crazy and everyone else in the world is sane? Am I the one that's actually upside down? And I don't want you to answer that question. That's a rhetorical question. I'm not asking for any answers to that. But boy, it sure feels that way sometimes. When you think, I don't understand what people are thinking. I don't understand what is motivating so many of the things that we see, and it can look very hopeless. But again, that's just such a small, tiny fraction of the picture that we're looking at. And so when we read prophecies, one of the effects that it should be is that it teaches us to hope. And should be teaching us to ready ourselves, which is the constant refrain in the New Testament when future events are referred to, that we should be preparing and readying ourselves for these things. So don't give up. And it's a message that continues even to Israel in exile today. Don't give up and give into the darkness of this world. as we move toward this awful time of judgment that's unlike any other that's coming, we just can't expect things to seem wonderful. But it also helps us to see where our hope is. Now, we live in a somewhat unprecedented time, and particularly in this country, and the freedoms that we still have eroded as they have been. We still have some freedoms. We still have ability to vote, to have a voice in process. We have abilities to run for offices and to be involved in political things and all of that. But understanding this should teach us that's not where our hope lies. Not that we don't want to do and to see good, and we want to be a voice for good, but political policies and political solutions and wisdom and strength of men, our hope doesn't lie there. That's not where this victory comes from. Isaiah is very clear, and especially as we get to verses 6 and 7 following, it's only in the one who can come and bring the light that dispels the darkness. That is the only true hope that we have as we look to the future. All right, we'll stop here and close with a hymn.